Hey everyone, welcome to ChaatNChat. My name is Josh.
My name is Miguel.
And today we are going to continue the theme of Indian independence for August by watching a video that was recommended to us that is on YouTube that is about what the devastating toll the British colonialism had on India, called the Unmaking of India. I actually graduated high school in India, and one of the classes I was required to take was Indian Studies. But I did okay. I ended with a B in that class, but the teacher really liked me, and so I really didn't have to do anything in that class, so I never studied.
So you kind of skated.
I did, because I never took a single quiz or test in that entire class, because every time there was a quiz, I would come up with some excuse saying like, oh, I'm so sorry, like, you know, I had to do this with family, it was a family function or something, so, I mean, that's, and so I never studied. And then when it was the final exam, I told her, I said, look, with all the other exams I have going on, I just don't have the time to study for this, and is there any other thing that I can do for the class?
Extracurricular activity.
Yeah, and she said, because my major was art, and so she knew I was really into art, so she said, study an Indian artist, do a short little essay on them, and then make a painting in the style of their art. So I did that, and I'd much rather do that than spend like 10 hours studying in a book.
Wow, but she didn't give that option to any of the others, so I'm like,
I was the favorite. Yeah. So unfortunately, I did not pay too much attention in my Indian studies, but I do know a little bit because I was still going to class every day. All right, so let's watch it together, and we'll find out.
We'll learn together.
In the year 1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined.
Whoa.
250 years later, India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished.
After
What happened?
independence.
Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India. In 1707 CE, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, regional powers jostle for supremacy. Land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation is so precarious that in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger to dealing with foreign aggression, but the British were not like those who had come before.
No.
They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine, whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy deindustrialized, its trade network severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade. The halcyon days of India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history. So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold.
And you know, one of the things about India that makes India so great is that the culture there and the community, like when you go there, they are so welcoming in their hospitality and everything. People come in and then you see all this, like foreigners, and you see all that, and then their first thing is like, how do we take advantage of people like that?
Yeah.
And it's so sad to see that.
She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great merchants, businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries. That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century. This
That's a lot
thriving textile
because,
trade
I
had
mean, you have
knock-on
a lot
effects
of
for the entire economy.
countries that do that.
For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost. As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry.
So smart.
We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry. Dhaka, Mausalapatnam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century. The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to 500 tons of goods. These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference.
Wow, that's
India
quality,
was a
man.
longtime pioneer in the global steel industry. As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India. While these blades were purchased as wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace. Though we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves. And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests. The first step, dismantling all native industry. To start, they established a legal monopoly over Indian textile goods and cut off the export market, which immediately disrupted long-standing trade links. Having now made themselves the exclusive buyers of Indian textiles, the British then changed the way that they paid for those goods. Instead of using foreign currency, they paid using the tax revenues extracted from India. The Indian economy stagnated and prices collapsed. Skilled artisans, who once fueled the vibrant Indian economic engine, were now significantly poorer and more restricted than ever before. And it didn't stop there. Soon enough, British manufacturers lobbied their government to completely eliminate the competition from the Indian textile industry. See, despite the restrictions imposed on Indian industry, British manufacturers were still finding it difficult to compete with Indian products. Company soldiers were sent to smash Indian looms. According to several different accounts, they even went around breaking the thumbs of weavers so that they could no longer ply their trade. But that's not all.
That is
To ensure that the Indian textile industry could not recover, adapt, or innovate itself back into relevancy, the British imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly every branch of manufacturing in India. India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore, so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial deindustrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture. Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax cultivators as the primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income and calculated before the harvest. The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers. To add insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament. The Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort. Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not negotiate tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have the means to pay, the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's largest source of revenue by far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers, and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquess of Salisbury, himself admitted, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested." And just like that, India and its people were bled dry. The fundamental issue of British overlordship was the fact that the British had no intention to become one with the land or to rule it as their own. The British saw India as innately and eternally foreign, and this justified their creation and maintenance of what scholars have referred to as an extractive colony. For comparison's sake, consider the
extractive
Turkic peoples who
colony.
invaded India and eventually formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Look, the Mughals were no heroes. They imposed unequal taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, plundered local treasuries, visited great violence upon their enemies, and exhibited a Persianized racial arrogance. But one thing is clear: India's wealth was preserved at a foundational level. After nearly 2 centuries of Mughal rule, India was still a dominant economic power, responsible for 27% of global trade. There's a simple reason for that. See, the Mughals had a foreign place of origin, Fergana, but they did not repatriate India's resources to their original homeland. India may not have been Fergana, but it had become their new home, and so their loyalties and energies were owed solely to India. Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No. It was extracted and repatriated to their distant, foggy homeland. How much? Modern economists have estimated that the total amount of wealth that the British extracted from India is in the ballpark of $43 trillion.
That is just
$43 trillion.
unbelievable.
That's
When
so
taxes are not
That's
spent
so
in the country from which
crazy.
they are
Oh my
raised,
God.
they constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Apologists for colonial rule often point to the railways as some sort of extravagant counter to the argument of extraction and divestment. But as modern scholars have pointed out, the railways serve as evidence for how exploitative and inefficient British investment in India really was. First, there's the bold assumption that Indians would not have built railways, like the Japanese or others, either by importing the technology or by developing their own. India had been
they
far
would've
too
built it.
advanced and cutting edge of civilization to not keep up had it been given the opportunity to do so. When the British came to India, the country was the leader of Asiatic civilization. Japan was nowhere. Now, in 50 years, Japan has revolutionized her history with the aid of modern arts of progress, and India, burdened by 150 years of English rule, is condemned to tutelage. But let's ignore that for now. Initially, the Indian railways were positioned as a grand investment scheme for British shareholders. The government guaranteed substantial returns of at least 5% per year. And when the revenues were not enough to pay out these returns, Indian taxpayers covered all the losses. Because of these taxpayer-backed guarantees, construction of the railways was extremely inefficient. Here's a fun stat. Every mile of Indian rail cost £18,000 to construct, as compared to £2,000 for the same mile built in the United States.
Wow.
All the elements of railway construction, steel, wagons, gears, engines, and more, were produced by British manufacturers.
Of course
And
they
of course,
were.
and
Of
they were
course they
charging
were.
given
premium
an opportunity
prices.
to produce their own manufactured alternatives, because the British government imposed restrictions that prevented Indians from competing.
So they
From making their
The
own
central
railroads.
purpose of the railways was to assist the British enterprise in the exploitation of the natural resources of India. In fact, the railways made it possible for the British to export enormous amounts of grain and other agricultural products, which sparked and exacerbated famines. Over the course of British rule in India, an estimated 35 million preventable deaths were caused by famines. That's millions more than those killed under Stalin or Mao, and that's 5 times more than the Holocaust. The British were directly responsible for this. They mass exported Indian foodstuffs to Britain and other countries in Europe, even during drought periods.
Now, that's not to say that those others aren't bad, but like those numbers are just horrible. Like that is just monstrous.
Yeah.
And you know, so we saw something like this, even though it was like a fictionalization of it, but in Lagan, right? And that was talking about these taxes and how they would like take more than people would even be able to feed themselves and would die from famine because they didn't care. They're like, I don't care about your personal problems. I only care about what the end product is going to be. So you either provide it, like even if you don't have food for yourselves, or you know we're going to take it forcefully and or you know torture you and all that sort of stuff.
Right. British just were so into themselves and not. Yeah, it's terrible.
Well, that's why I mean like the British Empire fell like all over the world is because they were terrible. And just like in the U.S., you know, trying to do the tax things right, Boston Tea Party, they almost were their enemies as well. Like they were their own enemies.
Yes.
Because the shit that they were pulling were like people all over the world. India stepped up and was like, no, we're like enough is enough. Like this is bullshit.
Food in India became too expensive for peasants to afford. According to Dr. Charles Hall, India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There is plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. The British had
Their
no
own
interest in
food.
provisioning for Indian lives. Famine non-intervention was official government policy. How ironic, given that heavy-handed British intervention and market manipulation is what sparked the famines in the first place.
Yep.
And when good people, Indians and foreigners, worked together to help famine-affected peasants, the British government made efforts to stop them. They were furious that the government's own failures were being highlighted. Don't believe me? Listen to this British officer in his own words. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands flung their wives into ponds to escape the torment of seeing them perish from hunger. But amid these scenes of death, the British government in India was unmoved. Newspapers were persuaded into silence. Strict orders were given to civilians. Do not acknowledge that civilians are dying of hunger. And if you think that Indians would have done a worse job, consider this. There hasn't been a single large-scale Indian famine in the 70-plus years since British rule ended. Not one. Independent India has its flaws, but it has been overwhelmingly better at providing for the care, safety, and prosperity of its own people. And now you know.
Yeah, I mean, definitely.
This
like
is something that
and-
I was very unaware of. I mean, I knew the British had really pushed down India, but I did not realize the severity, the time, the number of generations, and their whole manipulation. And I can't believe that. I mean, that's just downright abusive. I mean, when you are abusing people by making them buy the food that they just produced, you know, I'm just
It's
like,
just-
it's
like I can't even imagine. I can't imagine that situation. Like, what monster
Yeah.
would go into somebody's home and they get all of these ingredients and stuff, serve you a meal, and then you turn around and charge them for the meal that they just served you.
yeah.
Oh yeah, you invited me here as a guest. So it's like going to a restaurant and then ordering on the menu, but they're paying you to eat their food.
Exactly.
Like that is just, it's mind blowing. It doesn't make sense. Like that is just
also
like,
at the same time was that you made that meal with very limited resources, and by the way, you have very limited resources because they're beating you even to the market to get the resources that you need just to feed anybody coming in the door.
it's a helpless situation.
It is.
And
It's
so-
helpless and hopeless it becomes.
Yeah.
It can be very, I mean, in a way, it's psychological war on the people
Yeah.
because people would just become demoralized.
Well,
And-
they also don't have the strength, like, because the thing about it is you suck all their resources out of them, that you leave them with nothing to be able to have that energy, right? That's why I'm really excited to get into a lot of these movies. We're gonna see, I wanna start watching some of these movies about the freedom fighters. So there's a few YouTube shorts that we are going to watch, but there's also some movies that highlight some of these freedom fighters that I know that aren't as highlighted as, you know, some others are. So it's going to be really interesting to find out a lot of their stories about how they overcame these struggles, because from what we've seen, just the idea that they would have the energy and the resources to fight back is pretty amazing. So I want to see how all that goes. But one thing that I pulled from this video that we just watched that was just heartbreaking, as you and I both are artists, and seeing them have their artistry removed, that was so heartbreaking. Like the fact that they did such a good job in the world that no one could compete with them. So instead of trying to get their artists better, like the British, they're like, oh, ours aren't as good, so let's go ruin them instead of working on our own craft. Now, how you should compete is like, well, you know, they're really good, so let's find out what we could do to make ours good too. But no, they had no interest, and that's the lazy way, the laziest. It's just, oh gosh, this video is so upsetting.
It is upsetting.
Like but it's also good to know and know that history and know where that country is coming from, because it makes a lot of the things that India has done since independence that much more amazing, because they are able to compete on the world stage with just 70 years of independence, when all these other countries that mentioned Japan and obviously the US and all of these other countries were able to develop. I mean, the US, it's like 200
years, yeah.
200 some years. And so in 200 some years, and yet India is this country of 70 years of independence that is right up there. And they're like, I got to tell you, every time I go back to India, the changes that I see is like night and day. Like sometimes it's like a few years in between when I go, sometimes it's like every other year. But I got to tell you, every time I go, I'm just constantly like, wow, this is a completely different city, New Delhi, right? The subway system is far better than any subway system I've seen in the US.
Well, oh yeah.
So, I mean, and the technology, like it's like so prompt and everything. Like I love it. Like getting around New Delhi lately has just been so much easier than in the past. All right, guys, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification if you like these videos and you want to see more videos like these as we are learning about all of this. It
It's a journey.
It is a journey. Thank you so much. And अगर अब तक नहीं किया, subscribe करो, share करो और like button पर थप्पड़ मारो.